The situation music was assessed not emotionally, but technically. Risk analyses, scenarios, and legal assessments dominated internal meetings. At the same time, public pressure mounted. The media speculated about tensions. International observers raised questions, and narratives intensified on social media, becoming virtually impossible to control. This was precisely the palace's greatest concern. Once established, a narrative is almost impossible to reverse once it has taken root globally. By the end of this period, it was clear that the issue was no longer merely about individual public appearances. It was about who held the authority to interpret royal identity music, and how far individual self-presentation could go when it clashed with a centuries-old institution. Was this still a communication problem or already a structural threat to the monarchy's order? When did internal concern become an irreversible turning point? For those responsible at the palace, this boundary fell the moment legal assessments no longer merely outlined options but formulated necessary actions. The situation had evolved from a communication challenge to a structural question of jurisdiction. Prince William was now at the center of a process that no longer relied on delay, but on decisive action. Internal documents showed that previous agreements had reached their limits. Rules based on voluntary restraint lost their effectiveness as soon as they were no longer consistently followed. For the Crown's legal advisors, this was a crucial finding. Institutions only function as long as their rules remain binding. Where this binding force erodes, a power vacuum arises, which others fill. Prince William therefore commissioned a review of the legal instruments available to establish clarity. Historical precedents played an important role in this process. The aim was not to break new ground for sensationalism, but to apply existing mechanisms in a modern context. The assessments were sobering. The risk of doing nothing was deemed greater than the risk of intervention. Princess Anne supported this approach with a clear institutional perspective. Their analyses emphasized that protecting the next generation was not a political statement, but a core mission of the monarchy. This line of reasoning deliberately decoupled the decision from personal relationships. The focus was on responsibility, not blame. In this context, the role of minors once again moved into the spotlight. The legal opinions made it clear that any continued ambiguity could weaken their long-term position. Questions of education, public perception, and legal safeguards were no longer discussed hypothetically, but concretely. The Crown increasingly felt obligated to create a stable structure before external actors established facts on the ground. King Charles II remained in the background but was kept informed of every step. His reticence lent it additional legitimacy. The initiative did not originate from the top down, but developed from within the institution itself. This very point would later prove crucial in refuting accusations of personal motives. Simultaneously, international implications were examined. Legal experts warned that differing legal systems could further complicate the situation if a clear line was not drawn. The danger lay in the emergence of competing responsibilities that ultimately no one could control. For the palace, this was a scenario that absolutely had to be avoided. Prince William finally summarized these assessments and initiated the next step. It wasn't a dramatic act, but a formal escalation. Internal approvals were obtained, responsibilities redefined, and a legal framework prepared to ensure the ability to act. This moment marked the transition from analysis to action. Publicly, there was no sign of this yet, but behind the scenes, it was clear that the course had been set. The monarchy had decided to actively assume responsibility, even if this would provoke criticism. The central question was no longer whether to intervene, but how this intervention could be structured without creating new fault lines. This paved the way for a decision that went far beyond legal technicalities. Would this new clarity and stability create a debate that could permanently change the monarchy? Why was Princess Catherine chosen? And why was this step considered internally to be without alternative? With this question, the institutional process reached its most sensitive point. For the decision to entrust a single person with far-reaching responsibility meant more than a legal measure. It sent a signal both internally and externally. Internal evaluation dossiers painted a clear picture. Princess Catherine was seen within the inner circle as a stabilizing factor, firmly embedded in the institutional processes and, at the same time, free from personal ambitions beyond her role. This very combination proved crucial. The monarchy was not seeking a symbolic figurehead, but a functional solution that combined trust, continuity, and discipline. Analyses repeatedly emphasized that her previous reticence in public debates was interpreted as a strength. The responsibility towards Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor and Lilbeth Diana Mountbatten-Windsor was central to this. Internal documents emphasized that the aim was not control for control's sake, but rather structure. Issues of education, social integration, and long-term development were brought together for the first time within a coherent framework. For the planners in the palace, this was a watershed moment. Abstract concerns transformed into a concrete safeguarding concept. Prince William explicitly supported this direction. His role consisted less of public leadership than of coordinating internal support. Crucially, Princess Catherine was not perceived as a partisan figure. Rather, she was seen as an institutional constant whose loyalty lay with the crown, not with individual interests. This perception made it easier to minimize resistance. Princess and also played a formative role during this phase. Her assessment was clear. Shared or diffuse responsibility would prolong uncertainty. Only clearly defined accountability could calm the dynamics. This stance prevailed. The appointment of Princess Catherine was understood internally as a preventative step, not as a reaction to public pressure. King Charles II confirmed the chosen course without dominating it. His approval relinquished formal authority over the decision, while operational responsibility was deliberately left with the next generation. This interplay would later serve as evidence that it was an institutional, not a personal, measure. In parallel, the practical consequences were meticulously planned. Internal guidelines defined the extent of the new responsibility and where clear boundaries were drawn. Media appearances, symbolic gestures, and emotional narratives were consciously avoided. Instead, a pragmatic administrative approach took center stage. For many observers within the system, this was precisely the novelty. With the decision in favor of Princess Catherine, a circle was completed. The monarchy opted for predictability in a period of increasing unrest. Yet at the same time a new chapter opened, the implications of which were not yet foreseeable. Would this clear structure truly bring stability, or would it trigger new debates about power, family, and responsibility that would extend far beyond the immediate moment? What role did Prince Harry play in a process that seemed to be moving forward without him? And why did his silence ultimately become a factor itself? As the institutional decisions intensified, one thing became particularly noticeable: Prince Harry's minimal presence. In a situation where any stance would have carried weight, he remained conspicuously in the background. For observers within the system, this was more than just personal reticence. It was perceived as a structural vacancy. Internal assessments described Prince Harry's role as unclear and fragmented. He neither actively acted as a mediator nor visibly assumed responsibility within the ongoing process. This absence was not interpreted as a deliberate provocation, but rather as a sign of inner turmoil. Yet, this very ambiguity posed a problem for the monarchy. Institutions require clear lines of authority, especially when it comes to the well-being of minors and long-term stability. While Prince William increasingly acted as a coordinating force, Prince Harry's position remained undefined. Internal attempts at communication proved fruitless or failed to produce any reliable clarification. For the strategic planners at the palace, this was a critical juncture. A father who is institutionally elusive makes any sustainable solution difficult. The question was therefore no longer why he remained silent, but what consequences this silence must have. Added to this was the public dimension. The media interpreted his absence differently, sometimes as a silent protest, sometimes as a deliberate distancing. These interpretations intensified the uncertainty because they gave the impression of competing narratives within the family. For the monarchy, this was a risky situation. The longer the ambiguity persisted, the more it threatened to become a projection screen for external interests. King Charles II followed this development with growing concern but continued to refrain from actively intervening. His role remained that of a formal anchor, not an operational decision-maker. This reticence increased the pressure on the next generation to draw clear lines. Prince William thus saw himself as responsible for creating a framework that could also compensate for the absence of a key figure. Princess Anne assessed the situation soberly. Internal evaluations noted that while personal crises were understandable from a human perspective, they should not suspend institutional responsibility. This stance prevailed. Decisions had to be made in such a way that they would stand the test of time, independent of individual fluctuations. Prince Harris's inner situation was taken into account, but it was not allowed to obstruct the process. Thus, his silence paradoxically became a catalyst. It accelerated the need to define clear responsibilities in order to prevent further erosion. The monarchy took the position that responsibility had to be assumed where it could be exercised. This was not a judgment on personal motives, but a functional consequence. At the end of this phase, an ambivalent picture remained. Prince Harry appeared neither as an adversary nor as an active participant, but as a figure caught between two worlds. This position made him a symbol of a deeper tension between individual freedom and institutional duty. Would his silence eventually give way to a clear stance? And could this stance still influence the course taken? What long-term consequences would this decision have for the monarchy? And what did it mean for the future of Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor and Lilibeth Diana Mountbatten-Windsor? With the formal reorganization of responsibilities, the process reached its conclusion, but at the same time a new phase began, because every institutional decision of this magnitude has repercussions beyond the immediate moment and permanently alters the rules of the game. Within the monarchy, the move was interpreted as a necessary stabilization. The clear allocation of responsibilities was intended to end uncertainties that had built up over years. Prince William had achieved his goal of creating a structure that remains capable of acting, regardless of media moods or personal fluctuations. Princess Catherine embodied continuity and reliability, qualities considered indispensable during a period of global scrutiny. For King Charles II, the development represented a quiet confirmation of his approach. Through restraint, he had prevented the measure from being interpreted as a personal intervention. Instead, it appeared as a logical consequence of institutional self-regulation. This impression was crucial for mitigating international criticism and preserving the authority of the crown. The impact on the children was officially at the heart of all explanations. Internal plans aimed to offer them the greatest possible stability and keep them out of ongoing public controversies. Education, social integration, and the protection of privacy were defined as priority goals. With this, the monarchy consciously signaled its opposition to the increasing commercialization of family narratives. At the same time, the media landscape was changing. Many observers saw the decision as a precedent that could also be relevant for future generations. The message was clear. The institution was prepared to intervene actively if it perceived the protection of its youngest members to be at risk. For critics, this appeared to be an exercise of power. For supporters, it was long overdue clarity. Prince Harry remained an open question even during this phase. His future path seemed uncertain, his influence limited. The monarchy had positioned itself in such a way that it was no longer dependent on his active participation. This fundamentally shifted the family's balance. Personal reconciliation was not ruled out, but it was no longer a prerequisite for institutional stability. Princess and Duchess Sophie worked in parallel to update internal guidelines. The goal was to draw binding lessons from the crisis. The events should not be seen as an exception, but rather as an opportunity for structural development. Internal documents spoke of a new chapter in self-definition. The conclusion was sobering. The monarchy had acted to regain control, not to punish. But every decision of this kind leaves questions unanswered. Will this new clarity foster trust in the long run, or will it deepen existing divides between the institution and individual freedom? And how will Archie Harrison Mount-Boner and Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor one day look back on this period when they are old enough to understand their own history? The developments described here mark one of the most profound institutional interventions by the British monarchy in recent history. What appeared to the outside world as a sudden caesarean section turned out internally to be the result of months of analysis, legal reviews, and strategic deliberations. At its core was not a single scandal, but the creeping realization that existing rules had lost their power to enforce order. Prince William acted as the central coordinator of a process that was deliberately conducted in a sober and structured manner. Supported by Princess Anne with the formal backing of King Charles II, a clear line of reasoning emerged, assigning responsibilities and eliminating ambiguity. The decision to entrust Princess Catherine with a central role followed not a symbolic logic, but a functional assessment of stability, loyalty, and institutional reliability. Meghan Markle was viewed in this context not as an individual, but as part of a larger pattern, in which public appearances, narratives, and symbolism were increasingly perceived as a shift in boundaries. The roles of Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor and Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor inevitably moved into focus, as their names and their futures had become projection screens. The protection of the children became the central justification for all actions. Prince Harry remained an ambivalent figure. His silence and absence accelerated the process without actively steering it. For the monarchy, this was a crucial point. Institutional stability could no longer depend on individual availability. This fundamentally shifted the familial balance. Overall, this case demonstrates how drastically the monarchy is repositioning itself within a changed media and power landscape. The clear message is that protecting the next generation takes precedence over personal narratives. However, it remains to be seen whether this strategy will strengthen trust in the long run or create new tensions. Will this decision be remembered as a necessary stabilization measure, or as a turning point that permanently alters the relationship between family, the public, and the institution? Music. What was happening behind the walls of Buckingham Palace long before the public even suspected that one of the most serious institutional crises in the modern monarchy was brewing? While outwardly calm was projected, processes were already underway within that would fundamentally alter the power structure of the royal family. It wasn't a single explosion, a single scandal, but a series of quiet, precisely documented warning signs that intensified over months. Internal records showed early on that the situation surrounding Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor and Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor was increasingly spiraling out of control. Royal household officials registered a growing discrepancy between public image and institutional responsibility. Particularly striking was the repeated use of symbols, titles, and narrative references to the monarchy without formal authorization. In the eyes of the palace administration, this was not a minor detail, but a structural risk. Prince William, during this period, did not act as a public figure, but rather as the coordinator of a silent review process. He had received reports indicating a systematic blurring of familial roles, commercial interests, and symbolic power. Princess Anne supported this analysis with a sober assessment of the long-term consequences. From her perspective, the issue was less about current headlines than about whether the institution was still capable of protecting its youngest members from being exploited. At the same time, nervousness was growing in diplomatic circles. Evidence from various international contexts suggested that appearances and projects outside the United Kingdom were increasingly perceived as official or semi-official. This perception represented a red line for the palace, as it undermined not only the crown's image but also its legal legitimacy. King Charles II was informed of these developments but deliberately kept a low profile to avoid provoking an escalation. The turning point didn't come with a public outburst, but rather with the gradual coming together of individual pieces of the puzzle. Internal assessments spoke of a cumulative loss of control. Particularly problematic was the fact that formal attempts at communication went unanswered, further weakening the institution's ability to control the situation. During this phase, it became clear that inaction itself had become a risk. Princess Catherine moved more sharply into the internal spotlight for the first time. Her role was assessed not emotionally but functionally. Reports described her as a stable point of reference, institutionally anchored and free from commercial interests. This assessment was crucial, as it opened up the possibility for a solution that went beyond mere admonitions. It was about accountability, not punishment. At the same time, Prince Harry's absence was increasingly perceived as a factor. His silence was not interpreted internally as neutrality, but as a vacancy being filled by other actors. For the strategic planners in the palace, this was a warning sign. An institution that relies on continuity and clear roles cannot afford ambiguities in the long run. Thus, behind closed doors, a scenario emerged that had seemed unthinkable to the public: the possibility that the Crown itself would have to actively intervene to restore stability. Legal options were examined, historical precedents analyzed, and psychological assessments sought. Everything indicated that the situation would not resolve itself. At the end of this first chapter, there was no decision, but rather a realization. The monarchy had reached a point where inaction would have had greater consequences than action. The course had been set, not yet visible, but with a clear direction. Would the palace have the courage to pursue this course? And was the public prepared to understand the consequences when they became apparent? Why were public appearances suddenly crossing institutional boundaries that had been considered sacrosanct for decades? This question marked the beginning of the second stage of escalation in a development that had long been classified internally as critical. While public attention focused on individual headlines, palace strategists assessed the overall situation as a strategic pattern. At its core was the increasing fusion of personal self-presentation, the international stage, and royal symbolism. Meghan Markle moved to the center of these internal assessments, not because of a single appearance, but because of the sum of the signals she sent. Visual and linguistic references repeatedly surfaced that were interpreted worldwide as royal, even though they no longer formally belonged to the royal family. For the institution, this was not a matter of style but a question of sovereignty. Any implicit use of royal authority outside of clear rules carries the risk of a divergence between responsibility and control. International events, in which symbols, names, and narratives appeared in a context that seemed commercial, political, or brand-oriented, attracted particular attention. Internal evaluations found that these appearances in foreign media were often not perceived as private initiatives. Rather, they created the impression of a continued, albeit informal, representation of the monarchy. For the palace, this was an escalation because it touched on legal gray areas and triggered diplomatic tensions. Another sensitive issue was the visibility of Archie Harrison Mountbatten-Windsor and Lilibet Diana Mountbatten-Windsor in the public narrative. Even without direct appearances, their names, roles, and visions of the future were increasingly becoming part of larger narratives. Internal documents referred to this as the narrative binding of minors. The accusation was not that specific rules had been broken, but rather that a dangerous trend was emerging in which children were becoming projection screens for public strategies. Princess Anne assessed this development with unusual clarity. Her analyses emphasized that children of the royal line must not be used as symbols or arguments, regardless of the context. This stance found broad support within the inner circle. Prince William shared this assessment and simultaneously commissioned an investigation into whether existing agreements had been systematically undermined. The findings intensified the pressure for action. Meanwhile, Prince Harry remained conspicuously aloof. His absence from crucial votes and his lack of public engagement were increasingly seen internally as a structural problem. At a time when clear accountability was required, his silence had a destabilizing effect. This was particularly sensitive for the institution because ambiguity always leaves room for external interpretation. King Charles II was regularly informed during this period, but consciously chose not to intervene actively. His reticence was intended to prevent any assumptions about personal motives. Instead, the focus shifted to institutional processes.